I'm Victoria Chen, and I'm 28 years old, standing in my childhood kitchen, holding mortgage papers worth $650,000. I never imagined hearing these words from my own parents. After 5 years of sacrificing everything to save their home from foreclosure, working 3 jobs until my hands bled, they just told me they're giving this house to my sister Hazel instead. The woman who never contributed a single penny, who spent those same 5 years traveling Europe and attending art school on my dime. My world just shattered. Before we dive into this story, I'd love to know where you're watching from. Drop your location in the comments below, and don't forget to hit that like button if you've ever felt betrayed by family. Subscribe for more real-life stories that'll make you question everything you thought you knew about loyalty. Now let me tell you how my own flesh and blood destroyed my life in ways I never saw coming. Let me take you back 5 years to where this nightmare began. I was 23, fresh out of college with a decent marketing job, finally ready to start my adult life. I had just signed a lease on a beautiful downtown apartment, nothing fancy but it was mine. Then came the phone call that changed everything. Mom was crying, barely coherent, telling me they were 3 months behind on mortgage payments and the bank was starting foreclosure proceedings. Dad had lost his construction job after a workplace injury, and their medical bills from his surgery had eaten through their savings like wildfire. Without hesitation, I broke my apartment lease, losing my security deposit and first month's rent. I moved back into my tiny childhood bedroom with its faded pink wallpaper, and started working 3 jobs to cover their monthly mortgage payment of $3,200. Monday through Friday, I worked my regular marketing job from 9 to 5. Evenings and weekends, I waited tables at Romano's Italian restaurant, coming home smelling like garlic and marinara sauce. On top of that, I picked up freelance social media work for small businesses, often staying up until 2 in the morning creating content and managing campaigns. My hands developed permanent calluses from carrying heavy trays, my back ached constantly from being on my feet 16 hours a day, and I lived on energy drinks and whatever leftover food the restaurant let me take home. I watched my college friends post pictures of their new apartments, weekend trips, and dating adventures while I counted every penny and hadn't bought myself new clothes in months. But I told myself it was temporary, that family comes first, and that my parents would remember this sacrifice. Meanwhile, my younger sister Hazel was living her best life. While I was working myself into the ground, she had just started at the California Institute of the Arts, pursuing her passion for abstract expressionism. Her Instagram was filled with photos of art gallery openings in Los Angeles, weekend trips to San Francisco, and expensive brunches with her artist friends. When she came home for holidays, she'd complain about how stressful her pottery classes were while I served her homemade meals I'd prepared between my restaurant shifts. The most painful part wasn't even the physical exhaustion or financial strain. It was watching my parents' faces light up whenever Hazel walked into a room. While barely acknowledging my presence, they'd ask detailed questions about her latest art project or the boy she was dating. But when I mentioned getting a promotion at work or how exhausted I was, they'd give me a distracted nod before changing the subject. I started to realize that in their eyes, Hazel was the special one whose dreams mattered, while I was just the responsible one who handled the practical stuff. Every month for 5 years, I wrote that check for $3,200. Watching my own dreams of homeownership, travel, and financial independence slip further away. I postponed my engagement to my boyfriend Marcus because I couldn't afford a wedding or even a ring. I drove a 15-year-old Honda Civic with a broken air conditioner because I couldn't make car payments on top of everything else. I lived like a pauper so my family could keep their 4-bedroom house with its beautiful garden and 2-car garage. The worst part was that I actually felt grateful they were letting me help. How twisted is that? I felt honored that they trusted me with such an important responsibility, like I was proving my worth as a daughter. I convinced myself that once the mortgage was paid off, we'd all be closer as a family. Maybe then they'd see how much I'd sacrificed for them, how much I loved them. Maybe then I'd finally be the daughter they were proud of, not just the one they could depend on to fix their problems. But as I stood in that kitchen today, mortgage papers in hand, I realized I'd been nothing more than a convenient ATM, the bank account they'd been happy to drain dry. And now that I'd served my purpose, they were ready to discard me like yesterday's newspaper. The first attack had landed, and I was too shocked to even defend myself. What I didn't understand then was how methodically Hazel had been orchestrating this betrayal. My sweet little sister, with her doe eyes and artistic soul, had been playing chess while I was playing checkers. She'd spent years carefully planting seeds in our parents' minds, positioning herself as the deserving daughter while painting me as the controlling, selfish one. It started so subtly I barely noticed. During her holiday visits, Hazel would make offhand comments about how bossy I'd become, how I acted like I owned the place just because I was paying the bills. She'd tell our parents stories about her friends whose older siblings had taken advantage of family generosity, making them feel indebted and guilty. She was a master at playing the victim while simultaneously attacking. Victoria thinks she can control everyone just because she has money, she told Mom during Christmas dinner last year, tears welling up in her eyes. I know I can't contribute financially right now because I'm still in school, but that doesn't make me less of a daughter. Sometimes I feel like she doesn't want me to come home anymore. Our parents immediately reassured her, shooting me disapproving looks as if I'd somehow wronged their precious baby. The truth was, I'd never said anything remotely like what she was claiming. In fact, I'd been nothing but supportive of her education and career choices, even when they came at my own expense. But Hazel had a gift for twisting innocent interactions into evidence of my supposed character flaws. If I asked her to help with dishes, I was treating her like a servant. If I looked tired during family dinners, I was martyr complex and making everyone feel guilty. She was even more calculating than I gave her credit for. During her junior year, she started bringing home carefully selected friends who would gush about what an amazing opportunity it would be for a real artist to have a beautiful house for a studio space. They'd talk about how creative people needed inspiring environments to flourish, how commercial spaces were so expensive and sterile. Hazel would sigh wistfully and say how she'd love to have a proper space to work, but couldn't afford anything decent after graduation. Meanwhile, she was systematically undermining my relationship with our extended family. She'd call our grandmother and aunts with tearful stories about how isolated she felt, how I made family gatherings uncomfortable with my constant stress and negativity. She painted vivid pictures of me hovering over financial documents, making passive-aggressive comments about money, and generally sucking the joy out of every family occasion. The psychological warfare escalated when she graduated and moved back home temporarily. Suddenly, every interaction became a performance for our parents' benefit. She'd offer to help with something, then act hurt and confused when I explained how things needed to be done. I was just trying to help, she'd say with wounded innocence. I guess Victoria doesn't trust me to do anything right. She'd retreat to her room in tears, leaving me looking like the unreasonable older sister who couldn't accept help gracefully. But the masterstroke came 6 months ago when she started secretly recording our conversations. She'd provoke arguments by bringing up sensitive topics, push me until I lost my temper, then edit the recordings to make me sound unhinged and abusive. She played these clips for our parents when I wasn't around, building a narrative that I was becoming increasingly unstable and controlling. I'm scared of her sometimes. I overheard her telling Mom last month. She gets so angry about money stuff, and she acts like she owns everything because she's been paying the mortgage. I know she's stressed, but I'm worried about how she treats you and Dad when I'm not here. The implication was clear. I was financially abusing our elderly parents, using their dependence on me to control and manipulate them. The second attack came 3 weeks after that conversation. Hazel called a family meeting where she presented her concerns about my behavior, with all the precision of a prosecutor. She had examples, dates, even emotional testimony from our parents about how difficult things had become. She proposed that the healthiest thing for everyone would be for me to move out and start my own life, suggesting that my presence was preventing the family from healing and moving forward. Victoria has done so much for us, she said with perfectly calculated gratitude. But I think she's lost herself in this caretaker role. She needs to rediscover who she is outside of being our financial savior. And honestly, I think Mom and Dad need space to rebuild their independence and self-worth. It was beautifully manipulative, framing my eviction as an act of love and psychological health. Our parents nodded along like bobblehead dolls, completely convinced that Hazel's concern for my well-being was genuine. They couldn't see what I could see. The cold calculation behind her caring facade, the way her mouth twitched with suppressed satisfaction when they agreed with her assessment. She'd successfully rewritten 5 years of history, transforming my sacrifice into a character flaw and her selfishness into wisdom. By the time she finished speaking, our extended family was already choosing sides. Aunts and uncles who used to praise my dedication were suddenly questioning whether I'd been too controlling or overly involved in our parents' finances. Hazel had poisoned the well so thoroughly that my own relatives were viewing my years of sacrifice through the lens of her manipulation. I was no longer the daughter who'd saved the family home. I was the problematic older sister who needed to be managed and contained. The morning after that devastating family meeting, I knew I needed professional help. I couldn't fight Hazel's psychological warfare with emotion alone. I called every lawyer in town until I found one willing to see me that day. Benjamin Rodriguez had kind eyes and 20 years of experience in family law, but even he looked grim as I laid out my situation. "I have to be honest with you, Victoria," he said, reviewing the stack of bank statements and canceled checks I'd brought. "Without a written agreement outlining repayment terms or property interest, this is going to be an uphill battle. Legally, these payments could be viewed as gifts, especially if your parents testify that there was no expectation of repayment or ownership transfer." But Benjamin was thorough, and he believed in justice even when the law didn't make it easy. We began building a case based on unjust enrichment and promissory estoppel, gathering evidence that my payments were made with the understanding that I'd have some claim to the property. We documented every bank transfer, every conversation I could remember about the arrangement, every sacrifice I'd made based on the implied promise of eventual homeownership. The evidence was overwhelming when you looked at the numbers. $192,000 in direct mortgage payments over 5 years, plus utilities, property taxes, and major repairs I'd covered. I'd essentially bought that house twice over when you included the opportunity cost of the investments and savings I'd foregone. No reasonable person gives that kind of money away without expecting something in return. But Hazel was ready for our legal challenge. The third attack came in the form of a scorched earth counteroffensive that made me question everything I thought I knew about family loyalty. She filed a complaint with Adult Protective Services, accusing me of financial elder abuse. According to her detailed report, I had been systematically isolating our parents from family and friends, controlling their finances, and using psychological intimidation to maintain my grip over their household decisions. The APS investigation was humiliating beyond description. Social workers interviewed our neighbors about my behavior, asked invasive questions about our family dynamics, and scrutinized every financial transaction involving our parents. Hazel had coached them well. They repeated her talking points about feeling controlled and afraid to make decisions without my approval. They claimed I'd become increasingly aggressive about money matters and made them feel guilty for accepting help from other family members. Worse yet, our extended family rallied around Hazel's version of events with righteous indignation. Cousins who'd borrowed money from me in the past suddenly remembered feeling pressured by my loan shark tactics. Aunts and uncles shared stories about family gatherings where I'd allegedly made uncomfortable comments about money or seemed obsessed with financial control. Hazel had spent months laying the groundwork for this character assassination, and now it was paying dividends. The social media campaign she launched was particularly brutal. She created a GoFundMe page titled, "Help Elderly Parents Escape Financial Abuse," with a heartbreaking narrative about how their older daughter had isolated them from family and friends while systematically draining their resources. She shared carefully edited photos of our parents looking frail and worried, along with screenshots of bank statements showing the large payments I'd been making, framing them as evidence of exploitation rather than generosity. The story went viral in our small community. Local news picked it up as a cautionary tale about financial elder abuse, and suddenly I was the face of a growing social problem. My photo appeared on the evening news next to statistics about family financial exploitation. with reporters discussing the warning signs that I'd supposedly exhibited. Co-workers started giving me strange looks. Neighbors crossed the street to avoid me. Even my longtime dentist's office called to reschedule my appointment indefinitely. The professional consequences were swift and devastating. My boss called me into his office to discuss the situation, explaining that while the company couldn't fire me for unproven allegations, my presence was creating an uncomfortable work environment. Several clients had specifically requested to work with other team members, and the negative publicity was affecting our agency's reputation. He suggested I take a temporary leave of absence while things cooled down, which we both knew was corporate speak for find another job. But the most painful blow came when our parents filed for a restraining order against me. Standing in that courthouse, listening to my own mother testify about feeling afraid of her daughter, watching my father nod along with allegations that I'd been financially abusive and psychologically controlling, I felt something break inside my chest that I wasn't sure could ever be repaired. These were the people I'd sacrificed everything for, and they were looking at me like I was a stranger capable of terrible things. Hazel sat in the front row during the hearing, dabbing her eyes with tissues and occasionally placing a comforting hand on our mother's shoulder. She'd dressed conservatively, all soft colors and concerned expressions, playing the role of the protective younger daughter, who'd finally found the courage to speak up. The judge, clearly moved by the family's brave testimony, granted the restraining order and advised me to seek professional help for anger management and financial addiction issues. As I walked out of that courthouse, legally prohibited from contacting the people I'd spent 5 years supporting, I realized that Hazel hadn't just stolen my money or even my family. She'd stolen my identity, my reputation, and my place in the community I'd called home my entire life. I was now a pariah, a cautionary tale, a monster created from her imagination, but believed by everyone who mattered. The legal battle I'd thought would vindicate me had instead completed my destruction. That night, sleeping on my friend Jennifer's couch because I couldn't afford a hotel after paying legal fees, I came closer to giving up than I'd ever been in my life. The mountain of evidence against me, the unanimity of family testimony, the public humiliation, and the financial ruin seemed insurmountable. Maybe Hazel had won. Maybe I should just disappear and start over somewhere else. Let her have the house and the family and the life she'd stolen from me. Maybe fighting back would only make things worse. Just when I thought I'd hit rock bottom, the fourth attack arrived like a freight train I never saw coming. The IRS audit notice came on a Tuesday morning, delivered to Jennifer's apartment where I'd been staying for 3 weeks. According to the paperwork, I was being investigated for tax evasion related to unreported income from family loans and suspicious charitable deductions dating back 5 years. The penalties and interest they were seeking totaled over $40,000. I stared at those documents with growing horror, realizing that Hazel had somehow accessed my tax returns and financial records to manufacture this crisis. She'd filed amended forms on my behalf without my knowledge, claiming that the mortgage payments I'd made were actually loans to our parents that should have been reported as taxable income. She'd also reported fake charitable deductions that made it look like I was using our family's financial crisis as a tax shelter. The investigation paralyzed what was left of my financial life. My bank accounts were frozen pending the audit, my credit cards were flagged for suspicious activity, and my credit score plummeted overnight as the government placed liens against my assets. I couldn't access my own money to pay for basic necessities, let alone continue fighting the legal battles that were mounting around me. I was trapped in a bureaucratic nightmare that could take years to resolve. But the identity theft went even deeper than I initially understood. Benjamin and I discovered that Hazel had been using my improved credit score, built through years of responsible mortgage payments, to take out loans and credit cards in my name. She'd opened accounts with online lenders, used my employment information and financial history to qualify for substantial credit lines, then funneled that money into investments and personal expenses that had nothing to do with me. The paper trail was sophisticated and deliberate. She'd intercepted my mail for months, forwarding credit card statements and loan documents to a P.O. box she'd rented under a fake name. She'd used public Wi-Fi networks to apply for credit online, making it nearly impossible to trace the applications back to her. She'd even forged my signature on documents, practicing until her forgery was nearly perfect. This wasn't impulse. This was a long-term criminal enterprise that she'd been operating while living under our parents' roof. Most devastating of all was the discovery that our parents' house had been used as collateral for some of Hazel's larger loans. Without their knowledge or consent, she'd filed fraudulent paperwork claiming partial ownership of the property, then used that fictional equity to secure credit lines totaling nearly $100,000. The house I'd spent 5 years paying for was now encumbered by debts that our parents knew nothing about. Debts that could result in foreclosure if Hazel defaulted on her payments. The revelation came from an unexpected source. Margaret Wells, a family friend who'd known our parents for 30 years and had been growing increasingly uncomfortable with Hazel's recent behavior. Margaret worked at the bank where our parents had their mortgage, and she'd noticed some irregularities in the paperwork that didn't make sense. When she saw the news coverage about our family's elder abuse situation, she decided she had to speak up. Margaret called me at Jennifer's apartment, her voice shaking with nervousness and guilt. "Victoria, I know I could lose my job for this, but I can't stay quiet anymore," she said. "There are documents in your parents' file that show property transfers and equity loans that they never signed. Someone has been forging their signatures and manipulating their accounts for at least 2 years. I think your sister has been planning this for much longer than anyone realizes." The meeting with Margaret changed everything. She brought copies of the fraudulent documents, showing us a pattern of financial manipulation that painted Hazel not as a protective daughter, but as a sophisticated criminal who'd been systematically looting our family's assets while building a case against me. The elder abuse she'd accused me of was actually a projection of her own crimes, a preemptive strike to discredit me before I could discover what she'd been doing. We learned that Hazel had been having secret meetings with our parents for over 2 years, gradually convincing them that I was becoming too attached to the house and that they needed to protect themselves legally. She'd fed them a steady diet of horror stories about adult children who'd claimed ownership of family properties after making mortgage payments, painting me as a potential threat to their security. She'd convinced them to update their wills, adding language that specifically excluded me from any claim on the house. But the most chilling discovery was the evidence of ongoing threats our family was facing because of Hazel's financial crimes. The loan sharks who'd funded some of her riskier investments were growing impatient with her delayed payments, and they'd started making inquiries about our parents' property values and daily routines. Margaret had overheard phone calls about collateral recovery and alternative collection methods that suggested our elderly parents were now in physical danger because of debts they didn't even know existed. The cascade of crises was overwhelming. My credit was destroyed, making it impossible to rent an apartment or even qualify for basic utilities in my own name. My professional reputation was in ruins, making job searching nearly impossible in a small community where everyone knew about the financial abuse allegations. My relationship with Marcus was strained to the breaking point. He'd been supportive at first, but the constant stress and financial pressure were taking their toll on both of us. Jennifer, bless her heart, had let me stay on her couch for weeks, but I could see the strain in her eyes too. Her landlord had started asking questions about the extra occupant, and she was worried about her own lease agreement. I was a burden everywhere I went, a toxic presence that brought legal problems and social stigma to anyone who tried to help me. Hazel had successfully isolated me from every support system I'd ever had. The fifth attack came in the form of physical intimidation that made me realize how much danger we were all in. Men in expensive suits started appearing at Jennifer's apartment complex, asking neighbors about my whereabouts and daily schedule. They left business cards with vague services listed and phone numbers that went to voicemail boxes with automated messages. The message was clear. They knew where I was, and they could find me whenever they wanted. One night, I came back from a job interview to find my car windows smashed and a note tucked under the windshield wipers. "Your sister's debts are your family's problem. Pay up or we'll collect another way." The threat was subtle enough to avoid criminal charges, but specific enough to make me understand that our parents were now targets because of Hazel's financial crimes. She'd put our entire family at risk to fund her lifestyle and frame me for abuse. That night, Sleeping fitfully on Jennifer's couch with a baseball bat beside me, I realized that Hazel hadn't just stolen money or reputation. She'd created a web of financial obligations and criminal connections that threatened everyone I cared about. The house I'd sacrificed to save was now the collateral in a criminal enterprise I never knew existed. The parents I'd protected for 5 years were now in danger because of the daughter they'd chosen to trust instead of me. The breakthrough came from an unexpected source: technology. Benjamin suggested we hire a forensic accountant who specialized in digital financial crimes. And through Jennifer's connections in the tech industry, we found Carol Zhang, a former FBI analyst who'd started her own consulting firm. Carol had tools and expertise that revealed the full scope of Hazel's criminal operation in ways that traditional investigation couldn't match. Within 48 hours, Carol had traced digital fingerprints across dozens of financial institutions, revealing a pattern of fraud that stretched back almost 3 years. Hazel hadn't just been stealing from me. She'd been systematically embezzling from our parents' retirement accounts, redirecting their Social Security deposits to accounts she controlled, and using their medical insurance information to bill for services they'd never received. The elder abuse she'd accused me of was exactly what she'd been doing to them, hidden behind a facade of loving concern. The gambling addiction was the missing piece that explained everything. Carol found transaction records showing regular transfers to offshore betting sites, cryptocurrency exchanges tied to illegal gambling operations, and cash advances that coincided with major horse racing events and casino tournaments. Hazel had burned through over $200,000 in borrowed money chasing losses, always believing the next big win would solve her problems and allow her to repay what she'd stolen. But gambling addicts don't quit when they're ahead, and Hazel's debts had reached the point where legitimate lenders wouldn't touch her anymore. That's when she'd turned to predatory lenders and loan sharks who didn't care about creditworthiness as long as they had collateral to claim. Our parents' house, with its 4 bedrooms and prime location, was worth far more than Hazel owed, making it the perfect asset to secure her increasingly desperate borrowing. The most disturbing evidence was a series of encrypted messages between Hazel and associates who specialized in family asset restructuring and elder care transition services. These weren't legitimate financial planners. They were criminals who helped people manipulate elderly relatives into signing over property and assets. Hazel had been working with experts in financial elder abuse, learning techniques to gaslight and manipulate our parents while building a legal framework that would protect her from prosecution. We discovered voice recordings Hazel had made of our parents during their most confused and vulnerable moments, when Dad's pain medications made him disoriented, and Mom was exhausted from caregiving stress. She'd ask leading questions about their concerns regarding my behavior, editing their responses to create evidence of fear and abuse that never actually existed. The recordings she'd played for social workers and family members were carefully crafted pieces of fiction, not genuine testimony. Even more chilling was evidence that she'd been researching my daily routines, work schedule, and personal relationships for months before launching her attack. She had detailed files on my coworkers, friends, and even my medical records obtained through identity theft. She knew exactly when and how to strike for maximum damage, timing her accusations to coincide with my most vulnerable moments and leveraging insider knowledge to make her lies more believable. The dangerous associates in her life weren't just financial. Carol found connections to people with criminal records for assault, intimidation, and debt collection through violent means. The men who'd been following me weren't just loan sharks. They were enforcers who specialized in making problems disappear permanently. Hazel had gotten involved with people who didn't resolve disputes through legal channels, and our entire family was now at risk because of her poor choices. But the evidence also revealed something that gave us hope. Hazel had made mistakes in her desperation. The digital trail was extensive and damning, providing proof of crimes that couldn't be explained away as family disputes or misunderstandings. The forged signatures, fraudulent loan applications, and identity theft were federal crimes with serious penalties, and Carol's analysis provided law enforcement with everything they needed to build an airtight case. The parents' growing realization of what had really been happening was painful to watch, even from a distance. Margaret reported that they'd started asking uncomfortable questions about discrepancies in their accounts, missing documents they remembered signing, and financial transactions they couldn't recall authorizing. The medications that had made Dad confused also meant he'd been signing papers without understanding their implications, and Mom's trust in Hazel had made her overlook obvious red flags. As the truth emerged, other family members began coming forward with their own concerns about Hazel's behavior. Cousins admitted they'd felt manipulated during conversations about me. Aunts remembered feeling pressured to take sides in conflicts they didn't understand, and uncles realized they'd been fed carefully crafted narratives designed to isolate me from family support. The unanimous condemnation I'd faced was starting to fracture as people realized they'd been manipulated too. The media narrative began shifting as well. Local reporters who'd covered the financial abuse story started receiving anonymous tips about Hazel's gambling debts and criminal associations. The same social media platforms that had amplified her accusations against me were now buzzing with speculation about the real source of our family's financial problems. The GoFundMe page she created to protect our parents was flagged for fraud investigation after several donors came forward with concerns about inconsistencies in her story. Most importantly, we now had leverage. Carol's evidence gave us everything we needed to not only defend against Hazel's accusations, but to go on the offensive against her criminal enterprise. The restraining order that had kept me away from my parents was based on fraudulent testimony. The tax audit was triggered by false documentation, and the elder abuse investigation was actually a cover for the real abuse Hazel had been perpetrating. But even with all this evidence, I knew the battle was far from over. Hazel was cornered now, and cornered criminals often made desperate choices that put innocent people at risk. The associates she owed money to wouldn't care about legal proceedings or family reconciliation. They wanted their money, and they'd use whatever methods necessary to collect it. Our parents were still in danger, and I was still legally prohibited from warning or protecting them directly. The next phase of this nightmare would require careful coordination between law enforcement, legal professionals, and family members who were finally starting to understand the truth. But for the first time in months, I had hoped that justice might actually be possible, that the lies could be exposed, and that the people I loved might finally be safe from the predator who'd been living among us disguised as a loving daughter. The law enforcement operation that followed was swift and coordinated in ways that gave me faith in the justice system I'd started to doubt. Carol's evidence triggered simultaneous investigations by the FBI's Financial Crimes Unit, the State Attorney General's office, and local police departments in 3 counties where Hazel had committed various crimes. Federal agencies took the lead because the fraud crossed state lines and involved multiple banking institutions. Benjamin worked with prosecutors to ensure that my cooperation in the investigation would result in the restraining order being vacated and the elder abuse charges being dropped. In exchange for providing testimony and evidence about Hazel's crimes, I'd be granted immunity from any prosecution related to the family financial disputes. More importantly, I'd be allowed to contact my parents again, so they could be warned about the immediate dangers they were facing. The coordination with Margaret Wells proved crucial in protecting our parents during the investigation. As a bank employee, she had legitimate reasons to contact them about irregularities in their accounts, allowing her to warn them about potential security threats without violating any legal restrictions. She arranged for additional security monitoring on their accounts and advised them to vary their daily routines until the situation was resolved. Meanwhile, Carol's continued investigation revealed the full extent of Hazel's criminal network. The elder care transition services she'd been working with operated across multiple states, targeting families with valuable assets and elderly members who could be manipulated into transferring property. Hazel wasn't just a solo criminal. She was part of a larger organization that specialized in family financial fraud, and our case had provided law enforcement with their first major break in disrupting this network. The evidence compilation was overwhelming in its scope and detail. We had digital records of fraudulent loan applications, forged signatures analyzed by handwriting experts, financial transactions that clearly showed embezzlement, and recordings that proved Hazel had been coaching our parents to lie about their relationship with me. We had documentation of her gambling addiction, evidence of her connections to violent criminals, and proof that she'd been planning this scheme for years. But the most powerful evidence was the testimony from other victims. Once news of the investigation leaked, 3 other families came forward with similar stories of adult children who'd suddenly turned abusive and controlling after years of financial support. In each case, the accusations had been made by siblings who'd been struggling with gambling debts or drug addiction, and who'd learned to weaponize elder abuse allegations to cover their own crimes. The ally network that formed around our case was incredible. Margaret Wells connected us with other bank employees who'd noticed similar patterns of fraud. Carol Zhang shared our story with colleagues in law enforcement who'd been tracking related crimes, and Benjamin Rodriguez reached out to other attorneys representing families in comparable situations. What had felt like an isolated personal nightmare was actually part of a larger pattern of crime that affected hundreds of families nationwide. The financial forensics revealed something that made my blood run cold. Hazel owed nearly $400,000 to various creditors, including some very dangerous people who were growing increasingly impatient with her payment delays. The house I'd spent 5 years paying for was now the primary collateral for debts that far exceeded its value, and the loan sharks she'd borrowed from were already making plans to claim the property through whatever means necessary. Our parents' crisis deepened as they began to understand the full scope of what Hazel had done to them. The daughter they'd trusted with their financial security had been systematically stealing from them while manipulating them into believing I was the threat. They faced losing their home not because of medical bills or job loss, but because of gambling debts and criminal associations they'd known nothing about. The betrayal was devastating for them emotionally and financially. The media strategy Carol suggested was brilliant in its simplicity. Instead of trying to defend against false accusations, we'd let the evidence speak for itself by cooperating fully with legitimate journalists who wanted to tell the real story. Local news stations that had covered the original elder abuse allegations were now investigating the fraud case, providing detailed coverage of Hazel's crimes and the sophisticated network she'd been part of. The legal pressure on Hazel intensified daily as more evidence emerged and additional charges were filed. Federal prosecutors weren't interested in family reconciliation or plea bargains. They wanted to make an example of the criminal network that had been targeting elderly Americans and their families. Hazel's cooperation would be needed to prosecute the larger organization, but her own crimes were serious enough to warrant significant prison time regardless of her willingness to help. As Hazel realized the walls were closing in, she made increasingly desperate attempts to escape consequences. She tried to flee the state, but federal marshals arrested her at the airport with fake identification documents and evidence that she'd been planning to access offshore accounts where she'd hidden stolen money. Her arrest was covered extensively by local media, finally providing public vindication for everything I'd endured over the past months. But the first real victory came when the restraining order was officially vacated and all charges against me were dropped. The prosecutor issued a public statement acknowledging that the elder abuse allegations had been fabricated to cover actual crimes committed against our parents, and that I had been the victim of a sophisticated fraud scheme rather than its perpetrator. The official exoneration felt like being released from prison after months of wrongful incarceration. The moment I walked up to my parents' front door for the first time in months, my hands shaking as I rang the doorbell, I wasn't sure what kind of reception I'd receive. They'd been through their own trauma, realizing that the daughter they'd trusted had been stealing from them while manipulating them into believing lies about me. The guilt and embarrassment they felt was written all over their faces when Dad opened the door. "Victoria," he said quietly, tears already forming in his eyes. "We're so sorry. We didn't know. We couldn't see what she was doing to us. What she was doing to you." The conversation that followed was painful but necessary, as we began the long process of rebuilding trust and understanding how we'd all been manipulated by someone we'd loved and trusted completely. The house that had been the center of this entire nightmare was finally safe, but it was also forever changed by what had happened within its walls. Every room held memories of arguments and accusations, of lies and manipulation, of a family torn apart by greed and deception. Even with Hazel facing serious criminal charges, the emotional damage she'd inflicted would take years to heal, if it ever fully could be repaired. The criminal trial that followed was a media sensation that attracted national attention to the growing problem of financial elder abuse and family fraud. Hazel faced 14 federal charges ranging from identity theft and wire fraud to elder abuse and money laundering. The evidence Carol had compiled was so comprehensive that even Hazel's expensive defense attorney advised her to accept a plea bargain rather than risk a jury trial that could result in decades in prison. But Hazel's narcissism and desperation led her to make one final attempt at manipulation. She fired her lawyer and decided to represent herself, convinced that she could charm a jury into believing her version of events. She planned to portray herself as a loving daughter who'd made mistakes while trying to protect elderly parents from an abusive older sister. The strategy was doomed from the start, but it gave us the opportunity to see justice served in the most public way possible. The prosecution's case was methodical and devastating. They presented digital evidence of fraudulent transactions, expert testimony about the sophisticated criminal network Hazel had joined, and victim impact statements from our parents and other families who'd been targeted by similar schemes. They showed the jury recordings of Hazel coaching our parents to lie, documents proving years of systematic theft, and evidence of the violent criminals she'd associated with. My testimony was the most difficult thing I'd ever done, but also the most cathartic. Standing in that courtroom, looking directly at my sister as I described 5 years of sacrifice followed by months of deliberate destruction, I felt like I was finally reclaiming my voice after being silenced by her manipulation. The jury's faces showed shock, anger, and sympathy as they heard the full scope of what she'd done to our family. Our parents' testimony was heartbreaking but crucial for the case. They described how Hazel had gradually isolated them from other family members, convinced them to sign documents they didn't understand, and manipulated their emotions to turn them against me. Dad's confusion about the papers he'd signed while on pain medication highlighted how vulnerable elderly people can be to financial manipulation, even from their own children. The most damning evidence came from Hazel herself. Representing herself gave her the opportunity to cross-examine witnesses, but it also allowed prosecutors to question her directly about her crimes. Under oath, she couldn't maintain the facade of victimhood that had been so effective with our family. Her lies unraveled quickly when confronted with digital evidence, and her attempts to justify her actions only highlighted her lack of remorse for the damage she'd caused. The asset recovery process began even before the trial ended. Federal marshals seized Hazel's remaining accounts, personal property, and any assets purchased with stolen money. The house she'd used as collateral was freed from the fraudulent liens, and our parents regained clear ownership of their home for the first time in months. Some of the money I'd lost through identity theft was recovered, though much of it had been gambled away or spent on legal fees. The conviction was swift and comprehensive. The jury deliberated for less than 4 hours before finding Hazel guilty on all counts. The judge sentenced her to 12 years in federal prison, followed by 5 years of supervised probation during which she'd be required to make restitution payments to her victims. She'd also been banned from accessing her victims' financial accounts or contacting family members without court supervision. The public vindication felt surreal after months of being treated as a criminal in my own community. Local newspapers that had covered the original elder abuse allegations now ran front-page stories about the fraud conviction, with detailed explanations of how the real abuse had been committed by the accuser rather than the accused. The social media campaigns that had destroyed my reputation were now flooded with apologies and expressions of support. My professional life began to recover almost immediately. My former boss called to offer my job back, explaining that the company had always believed in my integrity, but had been forced to protect themselves from negative publicity. Several clients specifically requested to work with me again, and some even offered premium rates to compensate for the financial hardship I'd endured. The marketing campaign we developed around overcoming adversity became one of our most successful projects. The relationship repair with Marcus was more complex, but ultimately successful. He'd stood by me through the worst of the crisis, but the stress had taken a toll on both of us that required professional counseling to address. We'd learned hard lessons about communication, trust, and supporting each other through impossible circumstances. The experience had either strengthened our bond or broken it completely, and fortunately for us, it had made us stronger. But the most meaningful victory was watching our extended family grapple with their role in the crisis. Aunts, uncles, and cousins who'd turned against me based on Hazel's manipulation had to confront their own complicity in perpetuating abuse. Some apologized sincerely and worked to rebuild relationships. Others remained distant, too embarrassed or stubborn to acknowledge their mistakes. I learned to accept that not every relationship could be repaired, and that was okay. The criminal network that had facilitated Hazel's crimes began unraveling as federal investigators used our case to pursue larger prosecutions. The elder care transition services that had coached her were actually criminal enterprises that had defrauded hundreds of families across multiple states. Our cooperation led to additional arrests, convictions, and the shutdown of several fraudulent organizations that had been operating for years. Most importantly, our parents began the long process of healing from the trauma they'd experienced. They entered counseling to address the guilt and confusion they felt about being manipulated by their own daughter, and they worked hard to rebuild their relationship with me. The trust would never be exactly what it had been before, but it was growing stronger each day as we learned to communicate more honestly about our fears, needs, and boundaries. The house itself underwent extensive renovations, partly to address security concerns, but mostly to create new memories that weren't tainted by Hazel's presence. We converted her former art studio into a home office where I could work remotely, symbolically reclaiming the space she'd planned to use for her fraudulent activities. Every change we made felt like an act of healing, a way of moving forward while honoring the struggles we'd all endured. Financial restitution couldn't undo the emotional damage Hazel had caused, but it provided the resources necessary for our family's recovery. Therapy, legal fees, security upgrades, and career counseling all required investments that the recovered assets made possible. Money couldn't buy back the lost time or trust, but it could remove the financial barriers to healing and moving forward with our lives. The year that followed Hazel's conviction was the most challenging and rewarding period of my life. Healing from the trauma she'd inflicted required more than just legal victory or financial recovery. It demanded a complete reconstruction of how I understood family, trust, and my own worth. The process was painful but necessary, like surgery that removes something dangerous even though the procedure itself causes suffering. Professional therapy became as essential as breathing. Dr. Rachel Martinez specialized in trauma recovery for victims of family financial abuse, and she helped me understand that what I'd experienced wasn't just betrayal, but a form of psychological warfare designed to destroy my sense of reality. The gaslighting, manipulation, and systematic character assassination I'd endured had classic patterns that she'd seen in other cases, and knowing I wasn't alone in this experience was incredibly healing. The hardest part was learning to trust my own judgment again. Hazel's manipulation had been so sophisticated that I'd started questioning my memories, my perceptions, and even my motivations for helping our family. Dr. Martinez taught me techniques for grounding myself in objective reality when my mind started spiraling into self-doubt. She helped me understand that the very fact I was questioning myself proved I wasn't the narcissistic abuser Hazel had painted me to be. Family therapy with our parents was even more complex. They carried enormous guilt about believing Hazel's lies and allowing me to be hurt so deeply by their mistrust. But they were also dealing with their own trauma from being manipulated and financially abused by someone they'd loved unconditionally. We had to learn new ways of communicating that acknowledged everyone's pain without falling into blame or defensiveness. Establishing healthy boundaries became a crucial part of our healing process. I loved my parents and wanted to rebuild our relationship, but I couldn't return to the dynamic where my worth was measured by my willingness to sacrifice everything for family harmony. We created clear agreements about financial support, decision-making, and communication that protected everyone's autonomy while maintaining our connection. The professional growth that emerged from this crisis was unexpected, but profound. My experience with financial fraud and family manipulation led to consulting opportunities with law enforcement agencies and victim advocacy organizations. I became a speaker at conferences about elder abuse prevention, sharing my story to help other families recognize the warning signs of financial manipulation before it was too late. My relationship with Marcus evolved into something stronger and more authentic than it had been before. The crisis had tested every aspect of our partnership, from trust and communication to financial planning and family boundaries. We'd learned to support each other through impossible circumstances without losing our individual identities. Our engagement, delayed by years of family crisis, finally happened in a beautiful ceremony, surrounded by people who truly understood the journey we'd been on. The community that rallied around me during my recovery became a chosen family that complemented my biological one. Jennifer, who'd provided shelter during my darkest days, became a sister in every way that mattered. Benjamin Rodriguez became not just an attorney but a trusted advisor and friend who'd fought for justice when everyone else believed lies. Carol Zhang continued investigating financial fraud cases, and we often collaborated on projects that helped other victims. Career-wise, I transitioned from general marketing into specialized work helping organizations communicate about financial safety and family protection. The personal experience I'd gained with fraud, manipulation, and recovery gave me insights that no amount of training could provide. Companies hired me to develop campaigns that educated people about financial abuse, without scaring them away from legitimate family financial planning. But perhaps the most meaningful change was in how I approached relationships and trust. I'd learned that real love doesn't require you to sacrifice everything for someone else's benefit, and that healthy families support each other without destroying individual autonomy. I became much better at recognizing manipulation tactics and setting boundaries with people who tried to take advantage of my generosity. The house itself became a symbol of recovery rather than victimization. We'd renovated extensively, creating spaces that reflected our family's new dynamics and healthier communication patterns. The kitchen where I'd first heard my parents' devastating announcement was now a warm gathering place where we shared meals and honest conversations. Every room told a story of survival, healing, and hope for the future. Financial security returned gradually, but steadily. The combination of recovered assets, insurance settlements, and new income from my consulting work created a foundation for long-term stability that didn't depend on anyone else's decisions or generosity. I learned to invest wisely, plan for emergencies, and maintain financial independence, while still supporting family members in healthy ways. The ripple effects of speaking out about my experience continued expanding. Other families contacted me with similar stories, seeking advice about legal options and emotional recovery. Lawmakers referenced our case when drafting legislation to protect elderly Americans from financial abuse. Academic researchers studied the psychological tactics Hazel had used to better understand how family manipulation operates. Most surprisingly, I found forgiveness for Hazel, though it took much longer than forgiveness for our parents. Understanding her gambling addiction and the psychological factors that contributed to her criminal behavior didn't excuse what she'd done, but it helped me release the anger that had been poisoning my own healing. Forgiveness wasn't about reconciliation. It was about freeing myself from the burden of hatred. The wedding planning that had been postponed for so many years became a celebration not just of love, but of survival and recovery. Marcus and I designed a ceremony that honored the journey we'd been on together, including readings about resilience, truth, and the families we choose for ourselves. Our parents participated fully, having earned their place through honest acknowledgement of their mistakes and consistent efforts to rebuild trust. The professional speaking engagements I accepted allowed me to turn my painful experience into something that could help others avoid similar trauma. Standing on stages across the country, telling my story to audiences of family lawyers, social workers, and financial professionals, I felt like I was giving meaning to suffering that had once seemed senseless. Every person who recognized warning signs in their own situation made my ordeal worthwhile. 5 years have passed since that devastating morning when my parents announced they were giving the house to Hazel, and today I'm standing in that same kitchen, but everything has changed. The space has been completely renovated, filled with natural light and warm colors that reflect the healthier family dynamics we've worked so hard to build. My parents are here, along with Marcus, our 2-year-old daughter Emma, and several friends who've become chosen family over the years. We're celebrating the 5th anniversary of Hazel's conviction, and the establishment of the Victoria Chen Foundation for Financial Elder Abuse Prevention, an organization that's helped over 300 families navigate similar crises. The foundation provides legal assistance, emotional support, and educational resources to people dealing with family financial manipulation, and it's become my life's most meaningful work. What started as personal trauma has transformed into a mission that helps others avoid the devastation I experienced. The healing journey has been longer and more complex than I ever imagined. Learning to trust family again required years of consistent, honest communication, and the establishment of boundaries that protect everyone's autonomy. My parents and I now have a relationship that's different from what we had before, but it's also stronger in many ways because it's built on authentic understanding rather than unspoken expectations and assumed obligations. Professional success has exceeded anything I could have hoped for during those dark months when I was unemployed and living on a friend's couch. The consulting firm I started specializes in helping organizations develop comprehensive financial abuse prevention programs, and we've worked with banks, law enforcement agencies, healthcare systems, and family service organizations across the country. The personal experience that once felt like a liability became my greatest professional asset. My marriage to Marcus has been everything I hoped for and more. We learned during the crisis that we could trust each other completely even under the most extreme pressure. And that foundation of trust has made our partnership incredibly strong. Raising Emma in an environment of honest communication and healthy boundaries feels like healing generational patterns of dysfunction that might otherwise have continued through our family line. The legislative impact of our story continues to grow. The Hazel Chen Family Protection Act, named ironically after my sister, strengthened penalties for family financial fraud and created better protections for elderly victims of manipulation. The law requires banks to flag certain types of transactions involving elderly customers and provides additional training for social workers investigating elder abuse allegations. Our case literally changed how the system responds to family financial crimes. Hazel herself remains in federal prison, with about 4 years left on her sentence. She's never acknowledged responsibility for her crimes or expressed genuine remorse for the damage she caused, which I've learned to accept as consistent with the personality disorders that contributed to her criminal behavior. I don't maintain any contact with her, nor do I plan to when she's eventually released. Some relationships can't be repaired, and that's a healthy boundary rather than a failure. The financial recovery exceeded what anyone thought possible. Between asset seizures, restitution payments, and insurance settlements, I recovered about 80% of what I'd lost through Hazel's crimes. More importantly, I learned to build wealth in ways that couldn't be stolen or manipulated by others, creating multiple income streams and maintaining complete financial independence. Money represents security and options now, rather than a tool for buying family acceptance. Teaching opportunities have emerged from universities and professional organizations that want to educate future lawyers, social workers, and financial professionals about family financial abuse. Sharing my story in academic settings helps train people who might encounter similar cases, and their questions often provide insights that deepen my own understanding of what happened to our family. Every student who learns to recognize manipulation tactics becomes someone who might save another family from what we endured. The support network that formed during my crisis has evolved into lifelong friendships that sustain me through challenges I never could have imagined. Jennifer became Emma's godmother and remains one of my closest confidants. Benjamin Rodriguez handles all our family's legal matters and has become someone I trust completely with the most sensitive issues. Carol Zhang and I still collaborate on complex financial crime cases, and her friendship has been invaluable both personally and professionally. Community involvement has become a way of giving back while continuing to heal. I serve on the boards of several organizations that support crime victims and their families, and I volunteer with groups that provide financial literacy education to elderly community members. The work helps prevent others from becoming victims while allowing me to use my experience constructively rather than dwelling on past trauma. But perhaps the most profound change is in how I understand family, loyalty, and love. I learned that real family support doesn't require anyone to sacrifice their entire life for someone else's benefit, and that healthy relationships involve mutual respect rather than unquestioned obligation. The people who love you want you to be happy and successful, not just useful to them. That distinction has transformed every relationship in my life for the better. Emma's presence has added new meaning to everything we've built. She'll grow up in a family where manipulation and financial abuse are impossible, because we've created systems of transparency and communication that don't allow such behavior to flourish. She'll understand from an early age that love doesn't require sacrifice of your fundamental well-being, and that family relationships should enhance rather than diminish your sense of self-worth. The house itself has become a symbol of redemption rather than victimization. Every room holds memories of recovery, celebration, and new beginnings. The kitchen where this story began is now where Emma takes her first steps, where family friends gather for holidays, where honest conversations happen without fear of manipulation or retaliation. We reclaim this space completely, filling it with love that's authentic rather than conditional. Looking back, I can see how every stage of this journey was necessary for the growth that followed. The betrayal taught me to recognize manipulation. The isolation taught me to value genuine friendship. The financial ruin taught me to build sustainable security, and the public humiliation taught me to find strength in truth rather than reputation. None of it was pleasant, but all of it contributed to becoming someone stronger and wiser than I was before. What I want people to understand is that family financial abuse is often invisible until it's too late. Victims are usually people like me. Responsible, generous, trusting individuals who believe that love means sacrifice and that family loyalty should be unconditional. Perpetrators are often people like Hazel, charming manipulators who understand how to exploit generosity while positioning themselves as victims. The warning signs are subtle, but consistent if you know how to recognize them. The most important lesson I learned is that healing is possible even from the deepest betrayals, but it requires honest acknowledgement of what happened rather than minimization or premature forgiveness. Recovery takes time, professional support, and the willingness to establish boundaries that some people won't respect. But on the other side of that difficult process is a life that's more authentic, more secure, and more meaningful than what existed before the crisis. I'd love to hear from those of you who've experienced family financial manipulation or betrayal. What warning signs do you wish you'd recognized earlier? How did you rebuild trust after being deceived by people you loved? Share your experiences in the comments below. And don't forget to like this video if my story resonated with your own journey. Subscribe for more content about overcoming family trauma and building healthy relationships based on mutual respect rather than obligation. For those dealing with similar situations right now, remember that you're not alone and that resources are available to help you navigate legal, financial, and emotional challenges. The Victoria Chen Foundation website has information about finding qualified attorneys, financial counselors, and therapists who understand family manipulation dynamics. Recovery is possible, justice can be achieved, and you deserve relationships that enhance rather than diminish your well-being. Thank you for listening to my story and for supporting content that addresses difficult but important topics. Share this video with anyone who might benefit from understanding how family financial abuse operates. And remember that speaking truth about manipulation is one of the best ways to prevent others from becoming victims. Until next time, protect your boundaries, trust your instincts, and never let anyone convince you that love requires the sacrifice of your fundamental security and well-being.